Well, to talk to us more about political turmoil here in France, Renaud Foucart is a senior lecturer in economics at Lancaster University. Renaud, thanks for speaking to France 24. Consultations are ongoing. Lecornu has just heard back from heads of parties from the central bloc. What does that mean?
That means that at the moment they are trying to make this big decision of should we try a last roll of the dice by opening this time to the left and so making this incredible concession of suspending the pension reform. So there is a big case to have an attempt at a center-left government. It's the fact that if you remember the last parliamentary election, it's a two-round election. And between the first and the second round, all the parties from the far left to the center and some on the center-right withdrew their candidates and said to the voters, you need to choose between us and the far right. And the French voters overwhelmingly voted for the left, the center, and the center-right. So this is something that was some kind of mandate of a Republican France that came from the last election, but the day after the election, they all pretended it didn't exist. So this time, after several attempts of building something with the right, with the center, and the left, it's an attempt to try to somehow attract the left, but I've seen your parliament picture earlier. There is one possibility that is still somewhere perhaps behind the back of people in the Social Democrats, is that you don't necessarily need the right to be supporting you as long as you get abstentions from the far left. So I think the idea perhaps is to corner somebody like Jean-Luc Mélenchon and to tell him, look, you're going to have a left, center, left government that will suspend the pension reform, that will do nothing about the deficit, and that maybe will tax the rich. Are you going to make the parliament fall for that? Given that the only people who could win from a new election are the far right. If there is a new election, either there is no majority again, and so they need to find a deal exactly like today, or it's the far right and it's Bardella. There are no other choice.
Renaud, you touched on the suspension of the pension reform there. It seems to be a lot of talk on that today, a lot of, it could be high on the agenda. Is it feasible to suspend the pension reform?
Everything is feasible. At the moment, Lecornu said, I'm not going to do anything for 2 years. And, you know, the French deficit is high. It's going to be costly. It's going to increase public debt as a share of GDP. It's going to make the decisions in 2 years even more difficult. But in theory, there is nothing that stops Lecornu to say we wait for 1 or 2 years. The cost of the pension reform and the benefit expected would come anyway, mostly in the second year and further. So it's just the problem is Macron has been elected twice on the idea of doing a pension reform. The first time he cancelled it before COVID. The second time he passed it through like incredible unpopularity. So it would mean simply that the election of Macron and the election of the previous parliament was not enough to pass a reform. It would make the idea that French is unreformable perhaps even more salient. But in terms of feasibility, as long as you accept that you kick the can in the long grass and that all the big decisions are for 2027, yes, it is feasible.
You spoke about some other political parties there. The Socialists are interesting at the moment. It seems that Lecornu is compromising a great deal with the Socialists. What would you think the reason behind that is?
Well, the previous attempts were to try to get at the same time the right and the Social Democrats, or just the Socialists, together. And that was just enough to have a majority. But Lecornu falling in just like not even one full day of having a government, he fell mostly because of Bruno Retailleau, the head of the right-wing party, who seemed to have some personal issue with having another Bruno who was also a member of parliament there. Okay, so it seems that that's not going to work. They are too focused on the next presidential election. So the only hope to avoid a dissolution is to get the left on board. But the left would have to be more than the Social Democrat. It would have to include the Greens, the Communists, and somehow a tacit approval, so an abstention of the far left of France about Mélenchon. So this is not going to be incarnated by yet another old friend of Emmanuel Macron, Prime Minister. It means you need a personality coming from the left that would be seen as sufficiently different, sufficiently on the left to be acceptable by France on board, without losing the support of the centrists, including Edouard Philippe, who is also jockeying for position for the next presidential election and doesn't want to be perceived as a friend of the communists.
Oh, we spoke about the pension reform there. Let's talk a little bit about this idea of budget. Obviously, France in a difficult financial situation with a large public debt, 3.4 trillion euros. What can France do? I mean, we know that Lecornu has spoken about decreasing public spending. Will that be enough to get France back on the right track?
Decreasing public spending in general is incredibly vague. The problem of France is the problem of an aging population, and the two largest public spending by far is pensions and healthcare. So both Barnier and Bayrou, they fell for the exact same reason. They said, okay, we need to do something about the deficit. We need to cut it. So we need to, for instance, freeze the highest pension. So people who are not in France are always surprised, but you have public pensions in France of 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 euros a month. So this is the big chunk of public spending. This is where it can be cut. But clearly there was no political will to do that. So they both lost, and they both were censored, both by the left and by the far right. So Lecornu's idea is we're not going to do anything. He can talk about we're going to cut the spending, but he can cut a few millions here and there, a few billions here and there. As long as he's not discussing the big things, he will get nowhere in terms of decreasing deficit and making the French budget sustainable. So that means talking about pensions and pension reform. So a new pension reform, if they suspend this one, maybe something more consensual, but in the end, somebody needs to do it.
So as an economist, do you think that the pension is where the conversation should be, the pension reform is where the conversation should be currently?
I mean, everything which is about aging. So we're talking about pension, we're talking about healthcare, but we're also talking about tax because of the shrinking size of the labor force in France, but everywhere in Europe. When you have, like France, all the taxation on labor income, you have this general feeling in society that things are not going right because on your labor income, you cannot afford a house. You know, the category that is at the moment sustaining savings in France is the pensioners, the people above the age of 70-year-old on average are saving a quarter of their income. So this is something that means you cannot buy a house, you cannot make a living on your working income. At the same time, you have those very high pensions, and the entire taxation is on work. So this is something that has led to all those calls about wealth taxation, taxation of the wealthiest, etc. But at some point, it needs to get real. And getting real is not necessarily chasing Bernard Arnault all around the world, because in the end, it's just 5, 10 people we're talking about, and there are small amounts. No, changing taxation means moving a lot of the tax from the workers to other things. So, for instance, property, decreasing the highest pension, and that kind of thing are, as much as the population gets older, and those are older voters, this is becoming more and more difficult politically. But there is no other way if you want to decrease deficits.
Okay, Renaud Foucart, you're a senior lecturer in economics at Lancaster University. Thank you.
Thank you.